The way the seminar structure is set up, where they have to be able to articulate their thoughts, trains them in an ability of personal expression.
The fact that this is a talking college and that the students speak far more and are far more engaged than in any other college that I've ever seen.
They find this very, very helpful in the world.
It's very hard in African tradition to talk to elders and have them swayed.
We didn't have the intention to look for a Waldorf school or a Montessori school. We started visiting preschools to try to get a sense of which preschool would be the best fit for our son.
The first time I came to Waldorf, I just remember the smells. It smelled beautiful.
To your side, I went home this past summer like I could do it.
They do it well because they don't think of it as their own speaking. They think of it as listening to what others say.
People with the diseases that I take care of desperately want somebody to hear them. So I think those listening skills and being respectful of their opinions are important in their care.
It makes them, in some situations, the natural leaders.
Maria Montessori is an Italian physician and educator, born educated in Rome. Very unusually for the time, the end of the 19th century. She got a degree in engineering and a degree in medicine. The medical profession in Italy was not particularly accepting of women physicians at the time. And so the first assignment that she was given was to work with, to use the terminology of the time, mentally retarded children.
I'd sit across the table from the CEO of McDonald's, or the former president of Coca-Cola was an investor in the company. And I was able to sit there with people that were several generations older sometimes, which felt like something that St. John's was definitely giving to me.
In 1998, I put together a technology demonstration of non-proliferation nuclear technologies for Congress. And I couldn't have...
Beauty is innate, I think, and so young children know it and they're drawn to it. She didn't even turn around and say goodbye the first day. She was so ready to be here.
So she was given a number of them to look after. And essentially those children were warehoused. They were just put in a mostly dark room, no toys, no structured activities, and just left there. So what...
You just walk into these classrooms and imagining my son in those spaces and saying, oh, I could see this working.
When I think of early childhood, I think from 0 to 7. Then we have such very little time just to treasure movement and play.
What Montessori did was started to work with him, develop some educational materials. And the thing that brought her first to national attention was in 1901, her mentally retarded students took the test that was for normal children, and her mentally retarded children passed the test.
And healthy rhythm and healthy routine.
The basis of Waldorf education is the understanding of the human being that comes through the work of Rudolf Steiner.
Everything we do in the classroom, from all the sewing, all the craft activities, all those things are fine motor skills.
And obviously this is a striking phenomenon. Mentally retarded children, not very much at all is expected of them.
Because at this age, there's incredible brain development that takes place.
Do you mind if I could show you my Foxy?
I really like the way Waldorf approaches the developmental stage of the child and really looks to where the child is at and how they best learn.
I ran away from...
When I was really, really small in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, it was just magical, and there were these stories and there were these...
So the implication here is that more is possible, more quality of life, more education for children with developmental problems or outright disabilities. And then also a further implication that if mentally retarded children, with whatever Montessori was doing with them, can pass the state-mandated test for normal children, what would be possible to normal children if we started to adapt and use Montessori methods with normal children. So at that point, she was offered a position with being able...
A different perspective on the future is found at this school in Massachusetts. Here the future must start by getting away from the past. The Sudbury Valley School has swept away everything that's connected with the beginning of mass education: classrooms, timetables and teachers.
Other traditional schools are based on the idea that in order for a person to learn, you have to feed him information that you've pre-digested and pre-chosen. And that has nothing to do with the 21st century.
To work in the poor area of Rome with 50 or 60 children, and she opened her very first school, the Casa de Bambini, as it came to be called. Over the course then of the next decade, she developed a strong reputation in Italy, then in Europe, until a point where she was also heard of across the ocean in the United States.
But by the time she was ready to go to university, Montessori had shifted her interest from engineering to medicine and was determined to become a doctor.
She was one of the first women in Italy to train as a doctor, and her training was incredibly rigorous. And you just imagine that in her day, when she did dissection, she couldn't do it with the men. She had to do it at night and on her own. So she was very determined young woman.
Where people are really in control of their own destiny.
You're saying that model was created for what, the Industrial Revolution?
Well, when the Industrial Revolution started, there were no schools, mass education. That was something that was developed when people realized that machines back in the early industrial age did not have the kind of feedback that machines have today. You had to have somebody man them.
While she was still a student, Montessori gained a position as a medic treating children in a mental asylum in Rome.
She first came to work with children in the mental asylum because it was felt appropriate for a woman to work with children. She really started, as any doctor would, by measuring and weighing the children and prescribing appropriate diet.
Need experiences that would lead them in directions. But if you just say, will the default child just put out in the environment, with no specific desire for them to learn mathematics, with no guidance in that direction, how much will they learn? I think it's fairly limited.
If you watch how the children figure these things out without being taught, like these are even numbers and these are odd.
And then one day she spotted that the children were playing with bread at meal times, making little Play-Doh balls, and it was this manipulation of the bread that made her think, if these children had something to play with, something to manipulate, they might develop better skills. It was only when she started to work with the children that she developed the learning materials, which are the kind of foundation of the Montessori legacy today.
Montessori was part of the progressive movement in education that was happening at the time, but she was the first to put the theories into practice.
Doing a worksheet with pictures of money on it. It had a $1 bill and a $5 bill and nickels and pennies and dimes. And in each problem, we were supposed to add up how much we had based on these pictures. I mean, this is a worksheet, this is a photograph.
They could do just a certain amount of the work, and the rest had to be done by people. That meant you had to get people who were parts of the machine.
There are 200 on roll, aged between 4 and 19, and so long as they keep within the rules, they can spend their day doing whatever they please.
I don't see any reason to treat children different from others.
And at this point, there were some fireworks because the new method of philosophical education that Montessori was developing clashed with then prevailing schools dominated by pragmatism and what came to be called as progressivism, or a more politicized version of pragmatic philosophy. At that point, the big name in American pragmatic education was John Dewey. We've discussed him in an earlier lecture.
These kids had been unschooling and homeschooling really their whole lives, and they all knew each other, and I was a little nervous, but then I met them, and they're really friendly.
But the great thing is that they don't have children that are all 7 and 4, because they're not in classrooms where there are nothing but 7 and 4-year-olds.
Dependent on it. It is vital that education theory and practice should become informed by this idea. Watching a child makes it obvious that the development of the mind comes about through his movements. Mind and movements are part of the same entity. All right, moving on. Another prominent feature of Montessori education is its emphasis on choice. Of course, we know that much of traditional education is
They have friends that are 7 and 4 and 70 and 40 and 23.
They're willing to engage with you as an individual, whether or not you are
older, whether or not you are a person of authority, you know what I mean? Someone who might be perceived as someone in authority.
Great. So what happened in the case of Montessori, of course, was she continued to develop her school successfully in Europe and in the United States. But in the United States in particular, it was a mostly grassroots, parent-led initiative until toward the end of the 20th century, there began to be a resurgence, right, of interest.
The world, instead of breaking it down into worksheets and standardized tests, is the best way, absolutely, to become a grown person who can support oneself and who loves to learn.
Our culture sort of indoctrinates us to accept that there's an institution, there's a building, and there's a place where people can go, where children can go, and there are people in that institution who are going to do a better job of teaching your child than you could. And we don't believe that.
Although many people are familiar with this image of Franklin, they may not be aware of what Franklin actually did to bring electricity down from the heavens and eventually into our daily lives. "17-year-old Franklin arrived in the bustling city of Philadelphia in 1723. He was a destitute runaway from his old
He said, we've studied the theory, but we don't have any practical use for it yet.
And this year, after the second year of the school, there wasn't one student who left because he wanted to leave. There were 3 or 4 that moved out of the city or out of the country, and 2 students whose parents pulled them out because they weren't happy, but they're determined to return. There wasn't one student that felt he needed to leave. Like, everybody found their place in the school.
The practical use became the lightning rod. Having proven that lightning was an electric discharge, Franklin was confident that, like the sparks in his lab, it could also be safely drawn off by a metal conductor that was connected to ground.
So I left them with it. I came back after 2 months, and the 26 children marched in looking very, very quiet. I said, well, did you look at any of the stuff? They said, yes, we did. Did you understand anything? No, nothing. So I said, well, how long did you practice on it before you decided that you understood nothing? They said, we look at it every day. So I said, for 2 months you were looking at stuff you didn't understand. So a 12-year-old girl raises her hand and says, literally, apart from the fact that improper replication of the DNA molecule causes genetic disease, we've understood nothing else.
In 1752, he was able to convince other prominent Philadelphians to install lightning rods on important civic buildings.
The lightning rod stood on the rooftop. It was bolted down. It was stapled to a wire that went down the side of the house into the ground. A very simple thing that any local blacksmith could make. And yet what it did was something magnificent, which was that it intercepted a thunderbolt that would be about to strike a building and channel it harmlessly into the ground.
Some growth in any manifestation.
A couple years ago at the picnic, I got together a 5-on-5 basketball game just because we had a lot of players here and it just seemed like a good idea. And after that was done, I realized I had a lot of fun. So when the school year started up, I just decided to start up my own basketball tournament.
Hey guys, there's 10 seconds left.
No one is forced to play. If you want to play, then we all have a great time. And there's little kids and there's big kids and there's medium-sized kids. We really try and make it as fair as possible. Athletics of the school take a big part in more than just my life.